Namaste friends, thank you so much for tuning in to this video. If you're taking some time out of your day to watch this and wanting to learn more a little bit about the evolution of yoga, probably one of the most singular, interesting questions I think we tend to get trapped into is like, what style of yoga that I'm teaching? And there's a lot of different name brands of yoga out there. We have Bikram yoga, we have Ashtanga yoga, we have other different kinds of styles of yoga. There's core power. These are all name brands. They are all sourced from one school of yoga pretty much. And that one school is Hatha yoga. So Hatha yoga was evolved in the tradition, in the Himalayan tradition, was an evolution really from what we also know of as Raja yoga, or the 8-limb path, or Patanjali yoga, but more concisely classical yoga. So classical yoga is in and of itself its own school of yoga. We also have some other schools of yoga, by the way. Bhakti yoga, there's karma yoga, kriya yoga, prana yoga, there's also mantra yoga. So the list goes on. There are many different styles of yoga, but what you and I teach pretty much in what we stick to in our lane is Hatha yoga. I'm just going to kind of go out on a limb too and just say that sadly very few people really understand what Hatha yoga is and why we teach it and what that tradition or what that school of yoga is endeavoring for us to do. Most of you probably know this. You know the story that Patanjali gave us the Yoga Sutras about 2,500 years ago. And I'm not really going to get too much into that history lesson. I teach it very much in depth during my yoga teacher trainings here at Blue Osa. It is worthwhile mentioning that about 1,000 years after the Yoga Sutras came out was when the Hatha yogis started developing what we refer to today as Hatha yoga. Did people practice posture before? It is possible, but it was really the Hatha yogis, also known as the Nath cult at that time, that really started to develop this systemology of using postures as a way to start tapping into that beautiful and sublime eternal pranic force that evolves or that comes forth from the internal spanda within us, that creative inspiration that stems from the divine. And they said that when we unite with that we can start to deeply affect and transform consciousness, i.e. the mind. So the body was used as a way to begin accessing different aspects of the mind that for some people it just took them a long time to do in meditation. Meditation and doing a sitting practice for hours and hours and hours a day is not necessarily feasible for some people. There's also blocks in the body, there's restlessness, there's instability. So Hatha yoga gives us the opportunity to start addressing some of this restlessness and start addressing some of the instability. And therefore, once we start to address it, we shift the current, if you will, or the flow of the mind, and we can start directing the mind to our higher purpose. It is also worthwhile mentioning that the whole evolution of Hatha yoga really came from the Tantric yoga tradition. And the Tantric yoga tradition, I mean, there's lots to say about it. I could talk for the next few hours about Tantra. But at the source of it, it's really about how do we start to shift our energetic momentum. You're probably noticing in your life right now, as you're sitting there, that your life is kind of going in a certain direction. And some of us, if not most of us, feel very stuck in that direction. It's very hard to move out of a flow once we're in it. Yoga starts to open up that opportunity for us to shift that flow and move it in a slightly different direction. I often describe it as like a plane that's flying from Los Angeles to Hawaii. And during that flight, the pilot constantly has to make course directions because the plane goes off a little bit of a course. And if sometimes the plane goes off 1 degree and the pilot doesn't change it, instead of ending up in Hawaii, maybe you'll end up in Russia, which is probably not where you want to be if you were wanting to go to Hawaii. So it's really important for us to keep checking in and shifting our momentum, and Hatha Yoga does that in such a beautiful way that we really start to align our energetic flow with our life purpose, with the dharmic calling, if you will, of the heart center. So Hatha Yoga came about, and then many years later, about 100, 150 years ago, a man popped up named Krishnamacharya. And Krishnamacharya was a devoted Hatha yogi. And part of, I think, what Krishnamacharya awakened to, if not very early on in his life, definitely as a progression in his life, was to bring yoga to the masses. Really, before Krishnamacharya, and even up until about 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that yoga was thought about as something that only very holy people practiced. It wasn't thought about as something that was attainable for typical, what sometimes we refer to as householders like you and me. And so Krishnamacharya really wanted to bring it to the masses, and I often refer to him as the first influencer because he would travel around India and give yoga demonstrations. And so, of course, you know, back in the early 20th century and late 19th century, they didn't have Instagram, obviously, and the ability to make reels and whatnot. So Krishnamacharya did the next best thing and actually gave live yoga demonstrations. And these demonstrations were very well documented, and some of the things that he was able to do, he achieved what we sometimes refer to in the yoga tradition as yoga powers or siddhis, and he could do all kinds of things with those powers. And that's a conversation for another day about some of the things that he did. But it really started to capture people's attention and started to bring them into the possibilities of what yoga could be in their life. Really, before that, a lot of people didn't really practice posture, but one of the things that Krishnamacharya did was he made a direct link between doing the postures and how it affects our state of mind, and how it affects our state of health, and also how it affects our own spiritual evolution. And it was because of Krishnamacharya that we started to get Vinyasa Yoga. Krishnamacharya had a few students, but one of them was Indra Devi Pattabhi Jois, who invented Ashtanga Yoga, Mr. Iyengar, and one of them was his own son, Desikachar, who continued really teaching his father's tradition. But probably the two major influencers in that group was Pattabhi Jois and Mr. Iyengar. Both of them have indelibly left their mark on the yoga world. I think that in this evolution, and what we've seen is how much stretching and flexibility have now hijacked the yoga world, especially in our Western culture. We look at like the evolution of yoga in the Western world, and we see where did yoga really evolve. And there was kind of two places, but one of the major places that yoga evolved was at the local YMCA, inside gyms, and it was really fitness instructors that took yoga, and without any training, without any knowledge of this tradition, kind of viewed yoga as a way to stretch the body, and would include a little bit of yoga into their fitness classes, or they would actually teach a yoga class. They had no idea what they were doing. They just picked up a book, saw some stretches, people would hold it for a long time, they would tell people to breathe, and then that was that. And then as time progressed in the late 90s, early 90s and late 90s, as Ashtanga Yoga started becoming more popular, Many people would travel to India, start studying with Pattabhi Jois, come back, bring that into America. Other people would take those classes and then bring, elements of that into their fitness classes, into their quote-unquote yoga workout classes. And so this whole model, by the way, of a yoga teacher teaching from the front of the room is not yoga. A yoga teacher would never traditionally teach yoga in that way. That's a very Western idea of how to present a yoga class. A yoga teacher always walks around the room. Sometimes they may sit and watch from their podium or from their seat and watch the students, but their presence was always in the room and with their students as they were leading the yoga class. Because of Pattabhi Jois and because of his emphasis on contorting our bodies into pretzels, this idea of stretching and becoming more flexible really has become the dominant theme for a lot of yoga. And what I'm about and what I've been working on is what sthira is. Sometimes a lot of yoga teachers say that sthira is about strength and becoming stronger, and therefore you have to hold chaturanga for 5 minutes. That has got nothing to do with what sthira is. The idea of sthira is really getting still, is getting the body still. And I'm just going to kind of inject and ask a question. How many of you have actually ever been to a yoga class that has really focused on that quality of stillness? Every yoga class always has some movement in it. And the idea of sthira is how still can we really, truly become? The next quality, of course, is sukha. Sthiram, sukham, asanam. Sukha means a few things, but one of them, it means easy. It means effortless, that there's this deep quality of effortlessness. One of my favorite translations is joy. And the direct translation of sukha actually translates as good space. Su means good and ka means space. And so it's this cultivation of good space. Now you're probably thinking, well, yeah, I always feel good in my, my space and my body. And what we're really trying to do is to get the mind to start moving in a direction of good space. I'm going to jump ahead to Sutra 248 because 248 says that when we master those two qualities of sukha and sthira, that we are no longer going to be disturbed in life, that the pairs of opposites no longer affect us. And the pairs of opposites is all those things that kind of jump into your mind and pull you this way and pull you that way, that nothing really starts to affect you anymore, that you become this very strong pillar of yoga, of balance, of truth, of peace, of equanimity. That if you're flying from, say, New York to Los Angeles and you board your flight in New York and the plane sits there for 6 hours, that you're able to go, okay, and go back into whatever it is that you're doing or just being. That we're not becoming affected by what is going on in the outside world. I see a lot of yogis at Blue Osa. We have a lot of people coming on retreats, and for the most part, we've been very lucky in having amazing people, and once in a while we have very special people. And I remember this one retreat we had very close to when we first opened, that the people got very angry at Blue Osa because we weren't serving them enough coconut water. And apparently back then, and maybe even now, coconut water is all the rage, and if you do yoga, you have to drink coconut water. And I remember watching how disturbed they became because they didn't get what they thought that they should have. When we really embody yoga, when we really embody these teachings, we are able to start transforming our mind so that it becomes really still and very much at peace, that there's this effortless quality of how we start to move through life. And as we move through life in that effortless way, that nothing disturbs us. Where I hope yoga starts to move towards is to really embrace this idea of flipping the script on flexibility and stretching, that we eliminate those words from our yoga vocabulary, and that we start to replace them with words like stability, with stillness, with effortlessness. That we start to work on teaching yoga classes that leave people more stable than when they came into it, physiologically and mentally. That we can start to teach people how to activate their body, and in activating their body and activating their muscles, that they can start to then activate their whole life. My hope is also that yoga teachers start to evolve and educate themselves more in muscle function and what is happening in the body. That there is a lot of erroneous kind of perceptions out there in the yoga world, and things that we say. One of them is like opening the hips. Well, if you think about it from a biomechanical perspective, if we're going to open the hips, that means that we're dislocating the hips. And that's not how we want our students to walk through life. There's a lot of things that we say when somebody folds forward and they can't touch their toes. And I've heard so many of my teachers say to me like, oh, we need to open your hamstrings. We need to open your lower back. I spent better part of 25 years opening my lower back, and about 5 years ago, I walked into a surgeon's office, an orthopedic surgeon's office, and he said, you're probably going to need a spinal fusion. And that was a huge wake-up call for me to kind of like reassess, what am I teaching? How am I teaching it? And what is the goal of what I really want to do with my students? In the evolution of yoga, I pray that we start to return people to the true intention of what yoga offers. And at the end of the day, in my opinion, and we see this right in the first 4 sutras, that yoga not only is a tool or is the vehicle for us to return home to that most sacred ashram within us, so that we can remain completely at peace, completely still, and completely content. And then the second goal, I believe, that yoga is teaching us is, from that place, we can truly go out to manifest life's purpose. So I pray that you make it your mission to be in the endeavor of empowering others to find that still place within themselves, not just within your yoga class, but then when they leave your yoga class, that they are able to keep that sense of peace with them, and they too can go out to manifest and live their life purpose. Thank you so much again for listening. I hope you found this educational, informational, and look forward to hopefully seeing you one day at Blue Osa.